Good morning, students. Today, for BA second year students, we are going to study about the two ages prescribed in the syllabus. The first paper comprises of poetry of the two ages, pre-romantic age and romantic age. Students who have studied Dryden and Pope in the first year will know that in this particular year, we are going to study two different categories of poets. For your clarifications, I have mentioned few poets which have been prescribed in your syllabus. On the one side, we have four poets, James Thompson, Thomas Gray, William Cowper, and William Blake. And on the second side, we have another set of poets, William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, P.B. Shelley, and John Keats. These are the 8 poets that have been prescribed for the poetry. Now first let us understand the distinction between the pre-romantic age and the romantic age. If we just take a general view of the two ages, we can understand that basically the age is the romantic age, and when we say the pre-romantic age, it basically indicates something that is before it. So for the clarification of students, let me explain that pre-romantic age is also called the age of transition. It was transition from the neoclassical age, the age of town poetry, the age of mental aptitudes, moving on to nature, which further culminated into romantic poetry. Now let me explain to my students what is pre-romantic age and what is romantic age. Broadly viewed, the history of a later 18th century poetry is, as we have said, the history of a struggle between the old and the new, and of the gradual triumph of the new. On the one hand, there were writers who followed the general practice of the school of Pope. Please remember, Alexander Pope belonged to neoclassical age and aimed to produce the kind of verse which Pope had brought to perfection and made popular. In the works of these men, therefore, we recognize the continuance of what we may have called the Augustan tradition. On the other hand, there was a marked tendency among writers of the rising generation to abandon the practice of the school of Pope, respond to a different range of influences, and seek fresh subjects, fresh forms, and fresh modes of feeling and expression. In the works of these men, therefore, we may recognize the breaking up of the Augustan tradition. When we talk about these lines, we can just refer to the 4 poets that have been mentioned, James Thompson, Thomas Gray, William Cowper, and William Blake. These 4 poets were in fact those poets who were breaking away from the Augustan tradition of writing poetry and shifting to fresh subjects and fresh forms. Thus we can say the age of Johnson in respect of its poetry is obviously an age of transition, innovation, and varied experiment. It must however be borne in mind that the great general movement from old to new was the result of many forces and resolves under analysis into a number of different movements following many lines. We can just sum up and say, as we know that classical poetry, there are a few characteristics of classical poetry. I'll take one. The first was mainly the product of the intelligence and was strikingly deficient in emotion and imagination. Second, it was almost exclusively a town poetry. Third, it was conspicuously wanting in romantic spirit. Fourth, it was extremely formal and artificial in style. And fifth, it adhered rigorously to the close couplet. Now when we go a little back, we will just think and we can know that both Dryden and Pope, the 2 poets of the neoclassical age, adapted so many things which have been mentioned in the 5 characteristics. Their poetry was the poetry of intelligence, it was a town poetry, it didn't have any romantic spirit in it, and it was closely based on the close couplet. Now further when we move, at all these points reactions set in. What came in was emotion, passion, and imagination invaded poetry to the destruction of its dry intellectuality, and the old narrow didactic principles were discarded. Poetry ceased to concern itself exclusively with the town and began to deal with nature and rustic life. A most important feature it is the growth of the sense of the picturesque. Now when we come to the romantic age, we have 4 romantic poets, William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, P.B. Shelley, and John Keats. what we observe in their poetry are the following characteristics. First, we can say the romantic spirit revived, and this revival brought with its great changes in the themes and temper of verse. Efforts were now made to break away from the stereotyped convention of poetic diction and to substitute for the simplicity of phrases and the language of nature. The supremacy of the closed couplet was attacked and other forms of verse were used in its place. Now students, these are the broad outlines of the characteristics of pre-romantic age and the romantic age. When we discuss the poets in detail, we are going to talk about the style of poetry, the characteristics, and how the shift from the pre-romantic age to the romantic age is very subtle and very gradual. We must keep in mind the poetry of the first year, keeping in view the neoclassical poets, when we study the pre-romantic poets and the romantic poets. So, going for the characteristics and details that will be taken out in the tomorrow's class, we will also begin with the first poet of the pre-romantic age, this is James Thompson. And when we deal with James Thompson, we are going to take a bio note of James Thompson, the important works which were covered, which were written by James Thompson, and his poetry in particular. So please remember that second year poetry comprises of two important ages, the pre-romantic age and the romantic age, and how when we study these poets, we are going to analyze the different characteristics that mark their poetry. Thank you.